Hi everyone, back again, Christy Giannoni with one of my multimedia discussion boards. We are in week 3 of our MPA 510 History and Theory of Public Administration. This week we were tasked with looking at the specific articles from Gulick, Merton, and Appleby that we found interesting. First, I took a look at Luther Gulick on the Notes of the Theory of Organization. As a reminder from the lecture, we learned about the acronym of POSCORB, which has the planning, organization, staffing, direction, coordination, reporting, and budgeting. So I found this really interesting. The theory, actually looked up a couple other videos on it, and I wanted to add it in as a reminder. But in regards to the reading from our book, there was something interesting on page 83 that stood out to me. In a stable organization, the chief executive can deal with more immediate subordinates than in a new or changing organization. I found this really relatable to government because I have seen in the current agency that I have that reorganization, turnover, and this instability that he talks about can cause a lot of different challenges. And I think especially in leadership, in the style of organization, and in management. And so I thought that that stood out pretty significantly. And I think that's something that organizations currently do have to look at to see how they can maintain some of that stability. And you can't always prevent staff turnover. There's also things changing, especially with budgetary restrictions brought about by the COVID pandemic and some other economic challenges. And so you have to look at other ways to maintain stability so that these chiefs executives, these leaders, can deal with more immediate subordinates and you can model your structure of organization a little bit differently. I think this does, again, like I mentioned, hold true today, but like I talked about, finding those methods in place to prepare for changes, I think that that is a burden that has to be bared by the administration and by those leaders in the administration. Next, I took a look at Robert Merton's article, The Bureaucratic Structure and Personality. If you look on page 83, that is where I was highlighting some areas that were listed under the dysfunctions of bureaucracy. And so he talks a lot about and points out the trained incapacity, these blind spots, limitation of designs, and too much rigidity. And I thought that that was very interesting. And I think that it's a lot of hints and notes to other theorists that we have read about in these articles, where you had individuals like Frederick Taylor talking about scientific management and these principles that really broke down, these processes that they had in place with strict devotion to rules. And I think that Merton kind of points out where there can be shortcomings in that. And that if you have these, skills that were successfully applied to the past, this methodical, disciplined responses, that becomes a part of your workers' personalities, their trait, and they treat everything with that capacity. And I've mentioned in some of my other presentations that that's often a criticism of public government, is that it's just rigid, it's slow to change. And so I do think that this is still applicable today, but that is something that does need to change. I related it specifically to, of course, what I currently do for work in human resources, that while there's always going to be that necessary means for us to have fair and equitable treatment for everybody, it doesn't mean that each situation will be presented exactly the same. You've kind of got to be able to change and move with, if you're speaking to a council member versus a new applicant versus a law enforcement officer, that rigidity doesn't always be the most effective way to treat certain things. Next, I took a look at Government is Different by Paul Appleby, and I found his article the most interesting so far. I think that as somebody who does recruitment, hiring, class and comp for government, this is something that I have always found to be very interesting, the differences between working for a government agency and maybe a public company. I'm sorry, I mean a private company. So he talks about the significance of attitudes, that public interest attitude, and that sense of action. And there was hints of, again, other articles that we have read for this course where we had Weber talking about, government as a vocation. That was something that I focused on in my last multimedia presentation. And then, of course, Frederick Taylor as well, with the scientific selection of the workmen. So I like that these articles, even as far back as these were written, we're talking about that there is a benefit to somebody who is trained to know the differences between working in the government. And so the section that I specifically wanted to focus on was on page 120. And it's in it's in the second paragraph, a little bit towards the end. And it talks about those who are not government trained, the businessmen, but how the press ordinarily treats them with such special favor, and their prestige generally is so great that the public rarely learns of their failure. And what I related this to was the celebrities who try to get into government. So we've had, living in California, Arnold Schwarzenegger is the government, Caitlyn Jenner currently running for governor. And there was also talks around, former President Trump and his celebrity status and how that can make a difference in the polls and how people are voting and how the press is portraying these individuals who may not have any type of government experience, this vocation, this, being trained as a government worker, and how that can maybe affect the agencies that these individuals get voted into, hired into. And I think on a smaller level, we can see that with maybe, your local mayor. And so I found this to be a really interesting concept. And again, always kind of relating it back to what I'm currently doing for my profession in government. I found his article to be the most interesting because it talks about the attitude of a government worker, how government looks like as a business, and some of these challenging that, ordinary people brought into government tend to develop some special degree of public responsibility, but how they get there and how much they're willing to change if they come from a private sector or owning a business is really interesting. So thank you again for listening to my presentation. I'll leave you with this Proverbs that where there is no guidance, a people falls, but in abundance of counselors, there is safety. So while we're talking about these individuals who are willing to get into government, how government is structured and run, you hope that you have people who are really looking to get into it for the leadership sense to make a difference, to lead a community. And so I thought that was a great and important reminder as we're going through these readings. Thank you.